Great. Thank you. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here. I don't know about others, but for almost 2 years, Felix was lining everyone up. Those who were the speakers, those who were going to give, the future leaders. And I feel as if it was like, I'm going to finally meet this guy. I want to thank you, your colleagues, and everyone for putting together these times where you catalyze things. It's actually not directly about what you learn. It's actually not even directly about who you meet. It's like what thoughts got dropped into your head that later you'll go, oh, that maybe was helpful. It's not even the things there. And I'm hoping that, as I think has happened so far, I'll be able to continue that work. So notice this description, exploring fundamental unknowns. This comes about because since 2011, as I mentioned in the panel, have been thinking about ways to collect phenotypic information. And at first it was almost as a scientist, but as I did this more, I morphed or whatever, molted into realizing that actually the issues are much greater than scientists understanding. It was actually about people. It was about people trying to figure out what's going on in the world. It was about agency and who should actually run our lives, and what would it take to do that? And so the talk today is after having spent several years at Apple working on strategy there, a recognition that there were some fundamental, that's that word, fundamental things that actually most companies that are building products shouldn't be spending their time working on. I also mentioned 2011 because it was about that time that this transition from capturing information on the omics level and worrying about how would we ever capture it, I think people began to go, who's going to catch it on the other side? Who's got the mid on the other side? Meaning, what is it that we're connecting our omics data to? Earlier in the panel, some people were talking about ratios of this to that. The thing to remember is there is no set ratio. Actually, depending upon the particular disease you're looking at, there's a big difference between genetics and the environment. And so thinking of it in some simple way, as usual, simple doesn't work. Thinking of it in some simple way is probably naive. And I want to talk more about environmental. I'm not going to talk anything about Sage today. I'm just going to talk about where we're going from here. And again, Felix gave us the easy way to get started because he set these gaps up, and the gap that he put up, digital healthcare and personalized medicine gap, allowed me to find that it was legitimate to give the talk I was planning to give this morning, so that's good. Which was that I'm concerned that we're about to go through a hype cycle, as we always do. We're always going through a hype cycle. But this hype cycle of digital, I'm worried. Because it's so fantastical and people know so little about it. You put digital with AI and everyone's, okay, I'll fund it, it's great. The UK government, we need to do digital and AI. India, Sri Lanka, we're doing digital, we're doing AI, right? These people really know what they're thinking about? Probably not. And I want to talk about the gaps that I think are really important gaps, scary ones, that we should also be thinking about when we're all, my attitude in life is have a sense of urgency long-term and have patience short-term. Okay, and we're going to see this play out here. It's important for you to remember that as you're planning your lives. So there are 3 things I'm going to be talking about in a general way today. I'm going to talk about the fact that it would be nice if we could make individual health symptoms assessments for proximal actions and not aggregate them to the mean. Almost everyone I know takes these remarkable individual calculations and goes, okay, here's the aggregate behavior. Are you kidding me? Right? That's not a good use of the statistical power of the individual. Secondly, it'd be really nice, and in fact, I'm going to show it's going to be essential to find who's adjacent to you. Who's your nearest neighbor? I don't mean proximal neighbor. I don't mean who looks like you. I mean, who is it that's in their path through life in a way that actually, and ahead of you, that you could actually, by connecting you with that person, get a sense of where it is that you could be going and therefore be looking towards forecasting. And then lastly, feels as if it would be nice if we could learn how to nurture individuals. Notice I said nurture individuals, sharing their self-generated wearable data and insights so as to return agency. That's a theme that I'm going to be on, agency, back to the individual, somewhat to answer the question that whoever was sitting over there on who should be in control. Right? I think the question is, how could that be? Okay, so where do we start? Let's start with this word. This word, health, means something different to each of you. It's not like when I say, I'm going to play music, and you have a good idea of music. Health is really extraordinarily different. There's no good definition of health. It might be that health is an absence of disease, is there, but like a few other things, what they say is, you know it when you see it, okay? This is the son of a buddy of mine at Apple playing in Hawaii, okay? A lot of it is about having the freedom to do what you want to do. It's not, is your blood pressure this, is it that? It's about the freedom to carry out life the way you want to. So what we should be figuring out is how do we give that to someone? It's not about how do we keep them from dying, right? Or having a stroke. The real question is, how can we make it so that actually people have a chance to be themselves? So up until now, what most technology has done is this. This is the BART train, San Francisco. Now, these should be healthy people, right? They're privileged. They have income, probably employed, da, 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 da. What are they doing? Okay? They're sitting there, sucked in to this really dangerous world where they're thinking that the world is out there and the portal is coming to come up on some screen in front of them. And for the most part, what's really key is that until someone gets really sick, back to that comment I meant about delusion, we like to think of ourselves as in, I'm not sick, right? It's like, it's not even I'm well, I'm not sick, right? Don't have to go to the doctor, da, 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 da. So this is a problem, right? How are you going to help people who are basically going around like this, who who in denial, don't want to really know that they're sick, and you're saying you're going to try to make them better, you're going to improve their lives? So these are the things that I think drive problems with the current system. We have misassessments. I talked about that earlier. We're focused on end care when the high-tech, expensive machines can be brought in and the people who use them can make lots of money. We have poor recipes. We really, a third of the time, most of the things we have don't work, and we sort of have to remember that. They're done usually by exclusive guilds of people called doctors. I'm one, so I can say that. It's unlinked from a lot of the information we wish you could get. But the most important thing is this well, sick, and I'll get back to this later for scientific exploration, binary measure going on between whether you're well and sick. So that's what we're going to tackle. We're going to look at that. And the tools in the digital era have been, for the most part, ones that begin to say, I'm going to tell you this about yourself, and I'm going to try to help you. So here's a set of tools. When I was Apple, I helped on the building out of the research kit apps. Sage did 3 of the first 5 apps. So I intimately knew that period of this. And what became immediately apparent, and you saw it on one of the slides earlier today, so you can sort of, I'll zip through this. You could, if you put out an app, when you're not tied to a given center where you're saying anyone in the world, or for that matter, anyone in the States can engage, you will all of a sudden have trials of 50, 100, 150,000 people with a disease. Not normal, right? But people with a disease. We did an app around Parkinson's disease. Solomon, who's sitting in the 3rd row, you should get to know him. Good person who's worked in Parkinson's disease, was part of a team that we worked with. Put out an app, and within 3 days, we had more patients enrolled in the Parkinson trial than anyone had before. And within weeks, we had tens of thousands of people. And so the ability to start collecting really large amounts of data and putting in a little tool which said, hey, let's ask whether you want your data only going to those clinicians who are at that particular university, or you want it shared with qualified researchers worldwide. What do you think people said? 80% of the time they said, I want it shared with qualified researchers. Don't keep it to yourself. Give my data. If there's an element of trying to help others, people go, right? Let's try to make some sense, let other people make some sense. I'm showing you this data, and I want to talk about Parkinson because I want to make 2 points that I'm going to use later. The first is when it comes to trials, you're talking about how trials are done today, pharma, where we're going to learn. I want to get 2 key things in here. These trials allowed us to look at how similar people are. And there are two ways I want to do that. The first is called inter-individual diversity. So this is an example of 30 patients where we took their ability to do a tapping test, a sort of a function of motor skill, but we also measured their gait, their balance, and their voice frequency. Notice what happens if you rank order from good to poor on the top for tap. Look at where everyone is going along. It's not as if there's a set of people who are earlier in their disease and going late. If you were to have some imaging tool, and they now have ones where you can look at alpha-synuclein and other, you can go in and look at the brain, what you'll see is their outgrowth of those particles are ones that actually are going quite differently in everyone's head. So can you imagine if you're trying to do a trial, and you're going, I'm going to put this in bucket of early, and I'm going to put these in middle, and I'm going to ask how my drug is doing. What's going to happen if you aren't taking into account the dimensions of variation that people have at an inter-individual diversity? But the more interesting thing, which shows why you have to enroll 10,000 people and spend a lot of money to do a trial in Parkinson, is take a single individual, run them for 4 months, have them give measurements actually this is thousands of dimensions that we could run over those 4 months. Here, let's just look at tapping and look at multiple times a day. Let's do before and after they get L-DOPA. In green, they're going up. In red, they're going down. Yellow, white dots is where they only measured once a day. I don't know where they are, but look at that. Is that someone who's tracking along in a standard way? Is it a chronic disease that has some element of general continuity? No, it isn't. And that's important for trials, but something came up that really made it interesting. Someone said, let's throw into this app a chance for people to put in and tell us tell us why they think why they thought they were getting better or worse. So the thing would come up if someone was significantly different, little thing would pop up and say, hey, tell us why you think you're getting better or worse. And the responses to the why changes were fun. We got tens of thousands of comments back. But what they were that we should have known, and we didn't pay attention, is they were things like the neighbor got a dog, we're going to a new house, my son is moving. The comments that came back were the type of anecdotal information which, as a clinician, when you have X minutes to talk to a patient, you generally say, please, let's talk about your disease. What happens if, for all chronic diseases, whether it's arthritis or Parkinson, whether it's about depression or about Alzheimer's, that actually all of us, as we go through our lives, the impact and in fact the symptoms for the chronic conditions we have are actually being modulated by our sort of like, I don't know if I want to call it cognitive load, but it's basically our centeredness. What happens if actually that variation is there? What are we going to do in terms of how we help people, and how are you going to run trials that take that into account? There are some groups that have been doing remarkable inroads in the digital area. I just want to highlight a pair. They go together. They're about digital phenotyping in cognition and depression. Ginger.io, I think, will look back on and say that was one of the first groups to take serious, large, unstructured data and try to make sense of it. And they were doing well until they decided that they would shift their business model to being a concierge shop. And actually, it's really sad. They had a good thing going. On the other hand, MindStrong, which I'm hoping that Rick Klausman will talk about because he's involved in it, and my buddy Tom Insel is helping to drive. MindStrong, as far as I'm concerned, in the area of depression, is just nailing it. And if you want to look at an example, take a particular symptom, go and try to understand it. Look at that. Look at the paper that came out this last month on cognition that Paul put out. Even though they did not put a second data set in, which I would have given them a hard time as a reviewer, with the exception of that. They did leave one out type stuff. They're doing really superb work around a particular symptom. So good work is being done, is my point, with some of these devices. I want to go to the side a little bit for something important. The concept of context is something that we're underestimating, and this is my way of telling that story. This is Doug Whitney. He is someone who had 6 brothers who with him had double ApoE4 status. 6 of his brothers died, all of them in their 40s. At 66, he had no evidence of any of Alzheimer's disease. He and others got us thinking about when we say that something has complete penetrance, when we talk about how mutations stand out and the role of genetics, we were interested in seeing if we could make a stark case for actually that being wrong. So with Eric Schott, we did a study which looked at 500,000 individuals. We used existing data from 23andMe and BGI and all over the world, collecting data from whole genomes and others. And we said, let's look at 100 diseases where the particular mutations is considered to be completely penetrant, and you should have died, or the expectation was virtual certainty by the age of 5. And what we did was we said, let's go out in the world and not ask anyone any clinical information. Let's just take people over 30, because we don't need their clinical data. The fact that they're alive is enough. And let's say, if you're alive, I don't need to go through EHR or any of that crap. I'm just going to go out there and I'm going to see, are there any people who actually have these highly penetrant mutations that should have been alive? And out of the 500,000, we found only a dozen, okay? So you could say, whoa, that's nothing. On the other hand, what that says is every gene is going to have a context specificity that you need to take into account. And before you're giving treatment for this, or you're assuming this is going to drive someone to have this effect, it was meant to show the power of context in genetics. Imagine that on the same side, we're going to have that aspect of context and variability and penetrance on the nurture side. Okay? So with that, there has been more than enough apps to think that we should be able to make some insights into health. It's in the tens of thousands now, so all these apps are out there giving people something back. And what I want to do is I want to look at the risks that I think are endemic in how this is heading, whether it's by large companies or small app companies. I want to look at things that are actually going to mess it up as we go forward. So usually these companies have great pitches. They say their assessment goals are, we're going to collect single or multimodal data streams. We're going to validate that the devices match existing standards. Sounds like a good idea. We're going to use the device approaches to guide existing therapies. Right? So that's the pitch deck. What sits behind it that you should see is, what good is detecting versus forecasting? I remember coming to the UK about 20 years ago. I went to the page to look at the weather. I don't think it's this way now. And it would give me what the weather was today. I go, well, where's tomorrow's weather? And they say, no, we're giving you what it is today. Okay? What good is it going to be if we use our assessment digital tools to tell you where you are if it can't forecast? The bigger concern is that the standards that we have accumulated, I don't even think acquired is polite enough word for it, accumulated that says, this is the way I'm going to measure cognition, this is the way I'm going to measure even things like cardiac output, are pretty weird. They've come from tools over a century plus, and who says that's the best standard to anchor it to? And then also, as I think I probably drilled through your head because I've now said it 3 times, aggregation to the mean smothers individual data. Similar on the goals, so not on the assessments, but on suggestions and the goals there. Usually they say the purpose of this app is to collect data. The data is going to be shared with the physician, wonderful. And often, and these are real quotes, soon AI will tell you what to do. And that's back to that autonomous augmented discussion that we had earlier, so I'm not going to go through that. Suggestions and the issues there, I'm going to argue that though poised to better navigate between health and disease, who says people are going to actually take heed? Just because you tell someone, just because you can give them their weight on the scale, do they change what they're doing? Similarly, this AI-driven versus augmented suggestions. So on the denial side, I think I already mentioned this. This is real. Go read this beautiful book called Hooked. I think it's one of the most enjoyable books. Last year's book for me was Homo sapiens and Homo Deus. This year's book was Hooked. If you want to see how we get through our days by behaviors that are sitting there being driven at an unconscious level, and we're drifting through thinking we're doing really well, and the danger of how you manipulate those, think about that. And I think the parochial AI versus the central AI, I spent enough time. But the thing, so I trained in philosophy and anthropology before going into biophysics. The thing that I'm most worried about has to do with the issues around who's going to make the decision that that's a good thing for a person to do. It's not about what's a good thing to do, it's who's going to make that decision about what it's who should make that decision. So we began asking what were the alternatives. So we're saying, here's the system, here's what the apps are doing, they're headed this way, what's the alternative? What could you dream about? And what we wanted to do is similar to what you do if you've ever used a topographic map, you're out camping. We wanted to be able to make a path so you could tell someone in the next month to 1 to 3 months, if they keep doing this, what's going to happen? Are you going on course or off course towards what you're trying to do? Could you build a navigation system that would allow someone to know, this is where I am, and if I keep doing this, this is going to happen to me, and if I move somewhere? Could you build some system for health that was along those lines? And so in that dreaming mode, we thought, it would be nice if what we had was a personal health assistant. Not something that says where to park in the parking lot when I'm scheduling to the existing tired system. More about, can you just blow the whole thing up? What would you need to blow the thing up? And that personal health assistant would be one where you wanted it, you'd allow you to understand yourself, self-navigate before and after symptoms. Notice before symptoms arise. Provide the freedom to act with more certainty, improve individual lives beyond avoiding severe complications. So I'm really not interested in knowing whether that is something that is just going to help when someone is dying. I think the quality of what it feels like to be with a chronic disease could be improved, and that is not really being worked on very well. Nurtures actions in times of strength as opposed to vulnerability. And last, let's see if we could build this directly from individuals up. So is there a chance to build a system by each other for each other? Okay, is that feasible, or is that like way too dreamy? Some good news. To do this, you don't have to build a Google Earth for health. You don't have to say, I know where everyone is and where everyone's going over a long period of time. Actually, it's much more like the navigation tools that give you turn-by-turn directions. To be helpful to a person, really what you have to do is ask, what is the next thing that person should do? Right? If you could do that, right? What's the next thing, which is a lot easier from an AI standpoint than long-term, that would be helpful to do. And what we realized was that there were a series of fundamental boundary conditions that we thought if we could help generate and give to the world. So sit there and not sort of say, I'm going to make a company out of this, but instead, if we were to build up fundamental understanding, not unlike Semitech did when the semiconductor industry was there. You build up a set of tools that anyone could use, and they could go off and build apps, and your job was more to do the fundamental knowledge, almost like, as Chaz could tell you, SGC did in chemistry. Is there an SGC equivalent of understanding fundamentals? So what we realized was the first questions that were worth asking were, can we go beyond one-dimensional maps? I'll explain that later. Can we have evidence for actions that modify a disease in whom? You'd think that that was a given, but it's not. What signals emanate from us that precede disease transitions? Can we actually show that actually there are things that we can pick up before you have a symptom? Are there such things that are not micro elements of the signal, but actually other things that show that? And on suggestions, we realized that someone had to take some time looking at adoption and fall off from the devices in the realm of protecting versus entertainment. I think you know what I mean. The ability of apps to enable sharing insights and data, and the limits to our devices enabling individuals to act. And the assumption is, right now, either nobody's doing it or they're doing it like we often do our research, each company going, oh, I'm going to run an effort like this and this and this, and then not sharing it. So the real question was, could you do a general way that would allow people to learn more off of it? Pretty straightforward how to work on it. You've got to figure out ways of doing all-day sensing and recording. You can capture lots of things off of different devices. We now have a list of more than 15 devices, which I spent a lot of time thinking about, would I use a Oura Ring versus an OM signal versus a Muse versus that? So my world right now is thinking of what sensors can capture what signals and what would you like to use them about. You actually would like to collect messaging. You'd like to connect a lot of things about activity, et cetera. So just imagine you can pull in a lot of data feeds. Now when it gets interesting is the following. One of the places where AI has made extreme progress, maybe I could say one of the few areas where it has, is in image pattern recognition. It does so because, as LeCun and Ng and others showed, you can actually take and start with elemental elements, and there are compositional layers that stay intact as you move up to the natural world. So if you are looking at an image and you have these components, they fold into those, that turn into this, that fold into the image. That's why it's worked. So our interest is, can we show that actually symptoms do the same thing? What's the chance that there's an integrity in the physical world that allows you to take advantage of the same compositional layers that were important for AI to solve some of the elements of image detection and use those to actually figure out a way of pulling together and capturing symptoms? There's good work done by many. This is an example that Milos at University of Pittsburgh has done recently in cardiovascular disease, showing how you could take large EHR records, you could pull them in, the vector space has enough dimensions, and you could basically, as I think someone showed earlier, beat or be equal to clinicians in some elements. I would say, and I don't know, raise your hand in the audience if you've seen this outside of Rick that I'm sure saw this, but did you see in the last month the article that showed that for those who are tracking arrhythmias, that when they went out into the world, their ability to do that detection was like 0.66. They thought it was going to be at 95%. So for anyone who's dreaming, this is going to be easy. Remember the difficulty of being in the real world, right? And the difference between doing it in the smaller numbers. The other thing that we have done that I think Mindstrong has put time into is it's not just about the sensor data, it's not just about the activity data, but how you use your devices, how you hold them, actually says a lot about yourself. And if you haven't noticed it, the same tools that develop cybersecurity to separate you from the other should be possible to find those nearest neighbors. So we are interested in finding doppelgangers and trying to figure out what a doppelganger means. It doesn't mean just people with their pretty pictures, even looking at Ellen. What we're interested in doing is then seeing what we could do to actually go on this long-term goal. If those fundamentals are a way to get that, how is it that we might be able to build some type of exploratorium? So we had to pick projects. So we went out and thought, what were predictable conditions that actually were being tightly anchored in with physician visits that were complex, that had multiple symptoms, so we could really not do something like Verily or all of us did, which is take 1 million people and hope that someday something will happen. Now, there is a benefit. I'm being too facetious. There's a benefit. It's a baseline study. That's important. But if you're going to try to find transitions, it's not the way to find transition. So what we decided to do is let's start following pregnant women, and let's start following cancer patients who are getting cycles of chemotherapy, because we've got oogles of transitions in defined states with anchored things. We could build vertical stacks going between the signal that a clinician gets up with an active task with a passive task. And so you can see these symptoms, and I don't know whether you'd thought about before, I sure hadn't. Notice the similarity between what's happening to a cancer chemotherapy patient and women who are getting pregnant. Okay? There are a lot of reasons you could go for why it is, but we hadn't noticed it, and we think this orthogonal standpoint of looking at symptoms in these two populations will be beneficial. We'll get some signals here, and then if it doesn't happen here, it should help us. So we're studying pregnancy, and we're studying oncology patients. What are we doing? There's a way to take the signals that come off various devices. Those are in the the columns going down, and we can look at cognition and mood, sleep, gait, fatigue, and our goal is to have 3 to 4 independent multimodal sensor feeds for any one particular thing that we're trying to track. The complexities, though, are enormous. I just want to point out 2, so I stay on time. The first is back to this issue of symptoms and causes. If you take mood, sleep, and cognition, it's really hard to get an assessment of one if you don't know something about the other. They're entangled. And if you're going to say, I have a way of assessing mood and cognition, but I can't do sleep, it's harder. So in fact, there are lots of examples where you might try to pull a symptom out and say, I'm going to study some element of cognition or mood or sleep, that actually trying to understand the causes of it is going to be hard, because they're going to be causes of this interrelated set of entangled symptoms. Does that make sense? So you can't find everything that's affecting this if actually something over here is coming in and affecting that, and it has its own causes. So this is the type of complex problem that mathematicians like to look at, and clinicians like to assume is not a problem. The next bigger one, though, and I'm really worried about this, and I was worried about it when I was waiting to come in here, and the branch out there in the outside courtyard looked just like this branch that I have on here, is the following. Go to any disease, any of your favorite ones that you know well. You can go to hematologic or to cardiovascular, et cetera. And almost every disease that we're tracking, that we make drugs against, that we say we've improved people's disease against, goes in a linear fashion. Prodrome, early, moderate, advanced. And we try to say we're going to keep someone from going here, and we're succeeding. What happens if every disease has a branching structure where the trajectories for an individual actually look like that? What happens if that's really the way it is? How are we going to figure out how to change that? If everyone was going down a single path like this, it's straightforward. What happens if we don't know the branching structures of diseases? And I think this is really important. I think until we take that into account, our ability to model things for an individual, when you do an aggregate, it all looks good. It's a big tree, right? We've got these, no, seriously. But when we want to get to where I'm going to help you, I want to help you as an individual, what happens if that branching structure is there? That may be just as important as anything else that you're trying to find. And we've got to have the dimensional tools. Someone was talking about looking, within the world and out. We've got to have the dimensional tools that allow us to see, to figure out, maybe it's not a problem, maybe we've just hyped it up. But until we know, we should be looking at branching structures in disease. Another one that I think is really hurting us is the existing taxonomies of diseases, whether it's depression or arthritis, cirrhosis, or Alzheimer's disease. These things were developed hundreds of years ago when there were like 4 things that make a symptom. You have this disease if you have this symptom in the syndrome. There's a really good chance that that's a totally bogus way of saying you have this or that. So if you're trying to build drugs for something that was when I look to the left and then I do this and step on to this and that's who you are, right? We've got to have a sense of actually what that is. And I think someone has to take on, I think for movement disorders, it's actually pretty straightforward to do, and basically blow up the where is ALS versus Huntington's versus Parkinson, blow the whole thing up. Look at it, build it back up, and ask sort of, what does that structure look like? So the 5 complexities of forecasting that I think could crush us, that I think need to be resolved before we get all excited about these digital measures, were current binary labels, I think you got that one, well and sick. Inter and intra-individual longitudinal gradual measures have to be there as being smothered by the aggregate. The art of tracking symptoms is still evolving for forecasting. It needs to be looking at branching. And the entangled dependencies among symptoms that are not well addressed, and then this existing taxonomies. So the structure that we've thought about is, let's build a nonprofit. Let's make it a sort of virtual institute where we go around and we found the best expert in the world, whether they're in academia or in a biotech or in a tech company like Google, and say, I want you to bring your expertise to this project, and when you're working in this project, You're not going to take any IP for what you're doing. You're doing this to give back to humanity. And so we're asking experts who know how to build cohorts, who know how to do apps, who know how to build suggestions and do data flow and assessment, and finding the best people in the world and funding them to do that work. That's sort of the SDC, DARPA type model. And so we're bringing those leading experts, leaving them where they are, putting them together into teams, and then we're finding strategic investors who say, this is something I want to see done for the world or in the long term. So what are the deliverables? We're answering fundamental questions, really fundamental questions about forecasting symptoms. We're looking at the apps to enable pregnancy and cancer patients, which we figure people can go out and use in the developing and the developed world. We're working on clinical studies to accelerate oncology and pre and post approval. And if you're interested in those, I can spend more time on that afterwards. Maturing symptom modules. Any of these symptom modules we get, we want to put on GitHub and let anyone in the world sort of evolve them if they want to. But most importantly, it's sort of a general wisdom from asking fundamental questions about doability and robustness for the assessments and return of agency. So I want to end with something that I think is the most important thing I'm going to try to say today. And what's really beautiful was that it was coming up left and right all the way through the day already. As future biotech leaders, let's acknowledge the realities of the world into which we will build in designers. If you go down to the Cambridge Press bookstore this last month, not even a month, a book came out by Ari Waldman that you can't get on Amazon because it isn't there yet, that's about privacy as trust. This is a fabulous book. Most of the people who argue about where data should be stored and who should look at it and who gives the right to do it actually has done this in terms of rights. I have a right to this, I have a right to that. What Ari talks about, which I think is really beautiful, and it's an evolution of what was done at the Berkman Center at Harvard, is to say maybe the way to look at it and talk about privacy is that it's something where there's a power relationship, there's a equivalent of a commodity that you say, I am willing to give this to another for a purpose. And there's a way to structure the laws where the element of privacy as trust make it such that things such as Facebook has said, well, everyone signed away their rights, right? Everyone signed away their rights, okay? But I will tell you, the thing that freaked me out more than anything this last month was that the users at Facebook who heard these horrible things being done just kept using Facebook. To me, that got me extremely depressed. They just said, oh, well, it's okay. I get to be with my friends, da-da-da-da. And I'm really worried about human nature and the willingness of people to go, oh, that's all right, I'll let that data go. I don't think people are they're so addicted to what they're getting from technology. That's what I'm worried about. The other component of it is that, this is in Wired magazine, if you want to look this up, at the beginning of the year, called Big Data Meets Big Brother. I'm not worried what some of the tech giants here are doing. I'm worried about China. I'm sorry, I'm going to be that direct. In China, sorry, I had an apartment in Beijing for 7 years. I think I can say this. China has this social credit system where it looks up sort of how you're doing with paying your bills and other things, and then it takes the data of your friends and says that should count. And then instead of having like a normal credit rating, what it does is it allows you to have benefits in society if you're a good person. It's like, how do you build a prison where you have no walls? Okay? This is really serious. Okay? And I think we have to remember that this is the type of world that we're heading into. So there's a group of us in the Bay Area who've been looking at the incumbent responsibilities that each of us have as individuals. And I want to leave you with these 5 comments. One, so these are things that I think are rules. There's a manifesto that we're working on. This is not the end. But build things for which you would give your children unlimited access. Ask whether those things that the people are using, like Facebook, that's the way you feel about them. Explicitly list your values. Generosity and gratitude are 2 of them. Balance the excitement and energy of imagining a better future with the care and curiosity about what would go wrong. I would argue spend 80% of the time on what would go wrong and 20% time on what would go right. Remember, all models are wrong. All models that you're building are wrong. And but some of them may be right enough to be useful. And last, this is from the chairman of Nokia, who should know, success is intrinsically toxic. With that, leaders of the future, it's in your hands.